The envelope contained $50,000 in crisp $100 bills. Elizabeth knew the exact amount because the man sitting across from her had stated it calmly 30 seconds ago, like he was telling her the time. She stood frozen at the edge of the private dining section inside Aurelius, one of the most exclusive rooftop restaurants in San Francisco. Her long braids fell over the shoulders of her crisp black blazer. Her hands remained firmly at her sides. Her jaw was tight enough to crack. Dongjun sat before her with the kind of stillness that only truly powerful men possess. He was Korean, early 30s, and wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than everything Elizabeth owned combined. His black tie was perfectly knotted. A pocket square sat precisely in his breast pocket. An expensive watch caught the warm light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His hand extended across the table, holding the envelope like it was nothing. Like $50,000 was pocket change. Like he expected her to snatch it and thank him for his generosity. Behind him, two men in dark suits stood near the windows like statues. Their eyes scanned the room constantly, missing nothing. They weren't waiters. They weren't guests. They were guards, protectors, soldiers in expensive fabric. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Elizabeth looked down at the money, then back at Dongjun. Her expression was serious, conflicted, unreadable. She didn't reach for it. "No," she said quietly. The word hung in the air like smoke. Dongjun's eyebrows lifted by exactly 1 millimeter. His dark eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in genuine fascination. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a rare painting he'd never seen before. "No," he repeated. Elizabeth kept her voice steady even though her heart was pounding against her ribs. "I can't accept this. I just brought you your meal and refilled your water. That's my job. This isn't a tip. This is something else, and I don't want any part of it." Dongjun leaned back in his chair. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes remained fixed on her, calculating, measuring, intrigued. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. Elizabeth swallowed. She had heard whispers in the kitchen. She had seen how the manager practically bowed when this man walked in. She had noticed how every other staff member avoided this section like it was radioactive. She knew exactly who he was, or at least she knew enough to understand that refusing him was either the bravest or the stupidest thing she had ever done. "It doesn't matter who you are," Elizabeth said. "My answer is still no." For a long moment, Dongjun simply stared at her. The silence between them was thick enough to touch. His guards shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly unused to seeing anyone speak to their boss this way. Then Dongjun did something unexpected. He laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was soft, almost private, like she had told him a joke that only he understood. He placed the envelope on the table, picked up his glass of whiskey, and took a slow sip. "In my entire life," he said carefully, "no one has ever refused me. Not my enemies, not my allies, not the politicians who take my calls at midnight, not the businessmen who line up outside my office begging for 5 minutes of my time." He set the glass down and looked at her again. "And now a waitress in a black blazer is looking at me like my money is worthless." Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush with heat, but she refused to look away. "It's not worthless. I just didn't earn it." Dongjun's eyes flickered with something she couldn't identify. Respect, maybe, or curiosity, or something far more dangerous. He stood from his chair slowly, buttoning his jacket with precise movements. He was tall, over 6 feet, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been afraid of anything in his life. "Come with me," he said. "I need to speak with you privately." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "I'm working." Dongjun glanced toward the main floor of the restaurant, where her manager stood watching with wide, nervous eyes. He made a small gesture with his hand, barely a wave, and her manager immediately nodded frantically. "You're on break now," Dongjun said. 15 minutes, that's all I ask." Elizabeth looked at the envelope still sitting on the table, then at the 2 guards by the window, then at the man standing in front of her, waiting with an expression that made it clear this wasn't really a request. She had two choices: walk away and probably lose her job within the hour, or follow him and find out what a man like Dongjun could possibly want with a woman like her. She thought about her grandmother's voice in her head, the woman who raised her after her parents were gone. Her grandmother always said the same thing: "Never take money you didn't earn, Elizabeth. It always comes with chains." But her grandmother never said anything about refusing to listen. Elizabeth straightened her blazer and lifted her chin. 15 minutes, not a second more. Dongjun's lips curved into that half-smile again. "Follow me." He walked toward the back of the restaurant, and against every instinct screaming in her body, Elizabeth followed. "Before we continue with this story, I need you to do something for me. I pour my heart into these stories, and it genuinely hurts when people watch without subscribing. Please, just take 1 second and subscribe. It's free, and it means the world to me. Also, drop a comment telling me your favorite part of the story and tell me where you're watching from as well." Now, let's continue. Elizabeth followed Dongjun up a narrow staircase she didn't even know existed. Aurelius had been her workplace for 8 months, and she thought she knew every corner of the building. Apparently, she was wrong. The staircase led to a private lounge on the upper floor, a space designed for people who existed in a completely different world than the one Elizabeth lived in. The room was dimly lit, with leather chairs arranged around a low glass table. A full bar lined one wall, bottles of liquor that probably cost thousands of dollars each. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the San Francisco skyline that made the city look like a scattering of diamonds against black velvet. Dongjun's guards stopped at the door. They didn't enter. It was just the two of them now. He walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. When he turned and offered one to Elizabeth, she shook her head. "I don't drink during work," she said. "You're on break." "I still don't want it." Dongjun set the second glass on the bar and took a sip from his own. "You're consistent. That's rare." Elizabeth remained standing near the door, her body tense, ready to leave at any moment. "You said you wanted to talk, so talk." Dongjun walked toward the windows, looking out at the city below. When he spoke, his voice was different, less controlled, almost thoughtful. "3 weeks ago," he began, "a woman who looks exactly like you walked into one of my establishments in Los Angeles. She got past my security, accessed my private office, and stole something extremely valuable from my safe." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice in her veins. Dongjun turned to face her. "Not money. I have plenty of money. She took something personal, something that could destroy everything my family has built over 3 generations if it falls into the wrong hands." Elizabeth forced her voice to stay calm. "I've never been to Los Angeles. I haven't left San Francisco in 2 years." "I know," Dongjun said. "I've already verified your whereabouts. You were working a double shift here on the night of the theft. You have witnesses, you have security footage. You're not the thief." Elizabeth felt a small measure of relief, but it was quickly crushed by what Dongjun said next. "But your twin sister is." The room seemed to tilt. Elizabeth grabbed the back of a leather chair to steady herself. Naomi, her twin sister, the person she had spent the last 4 years trying to forget, the person who had broken their grandmother's heart before disappearing into nothing. Dongjun watched her reaction carefully. "You seem surprised that I know about her." Elizabeth's throat was dry. "We're estranged. I haven't spoken to Naomi in 4 years. I don't know where she is. I don't know what she's doing. I don't want to know." Dongjun set his glass down and walked toward her. He stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I don't believe that," he said softly. "Sisters, especially twins, always have a connection, even when they pretend they don't." Elizabeth shook her head. "You're wrong. Naomi and I aren't close anymore. She made her choices and I made mine. Whatever she stole from you, I had nothing to do with it." Dongjun studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a photograph and handed it to her. Elizabeth looked at the image and felt her heart crack. It was Naomi, thinner than Elizabeth remembered, with shorter hair and darker circles under her eyes. She was caught mid-stride on a security camera, clutching a worn leather book against her chest. She looked terrified. She looked desperate. She looked like she was running for her life. "That book contains every secret my family has kept for 3 generations, Dongjun said. Names, dates, transactions, relationships. If that ledger gets leaked to the wrong people, my entire organization will collapse. People I care about will be destroyed. Some of them might not survive." Elizabeth couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. "What do you want from me?" Dongjun took the photograph back and tucked it into his pocket. "I want you to help me find her." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "No. You haven't heard my offer yet." "I don't need to hear it. I told you I don't talk to Naomi. I don't know where she is. And even if I did, I wouldn't hand my sister over to someone like you." Dongjun's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Someone like me." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "You know what I mean." For a moment, the tension in the room was suffocating. Dongjun looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between anger and admiration, frustration and respect. Then he spoke quietly. "I'm not going to hurt your sister, Elizabeth. I just want my property back, and I'm willing to pay handsomely for your cooperation." He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small folder. He opened it and showed her the contents. Elizabeth's eyes widened. Inside was a detailed report about her life, her education at UC Berkeley, her degree in architecture, the firm she had joined after graduation, the financial scandal that destroyed the firm and blacklisted everyone associated with it, her 3 jobs, her tutoring side hustle, her weekend work at the boutique in Nob Hill, her savings account balance, her dream of opening her own design consultancy. "You've been researching me," she said flatly. "I research everyone," Dongjun replied. "But you're more interesting than most. Top of your class at Berkeley. Brilliant design portfolio. Glowing recommendations from every professor who taught you. And then your career was destroyed by something that wasn't your fault. You've spent 2 years rebuilding from nothing while the people who actually committed the fraud walked away with golden parachutes." Elizabeth felt exposed, violated, like he had peeled back her skin and examined everything underneath. "Here's my offer," Dongjun continued. "Help me find Naomi and recover my ledger. In return, I will fully fund your architecture consultancy. I will personally guarantee your first contract, a development project worth $2 million. And I will use my connections to have your name removed from every blacklist in the industry." Elizabeth stared at him. "That's not possible." "Everything is possible when you know the right people." She shook her head slowly. "This is insane. You're asking me to betray my sister for money and career advancement." Dongjun stepped closer. "I'm asking you to help me retrieve something that belongs to me. What happens to your sister afterward is between you and her. I give you my word that she will not be harmed. But I need that ledger back, Elizabeth, and you're the only person who can help me get it." Elizabeth looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. She found none. He was telling the truth, or at least he believed he was. But that didn't mean she could trust him. "Why me?" she asked. "You have resources, you have people. Why do you need a waitress to find your missing book?" Dongjun's jaw tightened. "Because your sister is smart, smarter than anyone I've ever dealt with. She's avoided every trap I've set. She's disappeared from every radar. My best people have spent 3 weeks searching and found nothing. But there's one thing they can't replicate." He paused. "Naomi still loves you. She'll come out of hiding if you reach out to her. I'm certain of it." Elizabeth felt something twist in her chest. Love. Did Naomi still love her? After 4 years of silence? After everything that happened? She thought about the last time she saw her sister. The screaming, the tears, the broken vase on their grandmother's floor, the door slamming, the silence that followed. She thought about all the nights she had wondered where Naomi was, whether she was safe, whether she was alive. And now she had an answer. Naomi was alive. Naomi was in trouble. And Naomi was carrying something that made one of the most powerful men in California desperate enough to negotiate with a waitress. Elizabeth made a decision. "I need to think about it," she said. Dongjun nodded slowly. "I'll give you 24 hours. After that, my offer expires." He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. It was matte black with silver lettering, just his name and a phone number. "Call me when you decide," he said. Elizabeth took the card and walked toward the door. She paused with her hand on the handle and looked back at him. "If I do this," she said, "and I'm not saying I will, but if I do, I have conditions." Dongjun inclined his head. "I'm listening." "No one touches Naomi. Not your guards, not your people. No one. When we find her, I talk to her alone first. And when this is over, I walk away clean. No strings, no debts, no follow-up visits." Dongjun considered her words. Then he nodded. "Agreed." Elizabeth opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The guards watched her pass, their expressions blank. She walked down the stairs, through the restaurant, and out into the cool San Francisco night. Her hands were shaking. Her mind was spinning. But one thing was clear. Her simple, carefully controlled life had just become very complicated. Elizabeth returned to her small apartment in Oakland just after midnight. The space was barely 500 square feet, but she had made it her own. Architecture books lined the shelves. Sketches and blueprints covered the walls. A framed photograph of her grandmother sat on the nightstand, the only decoration that wasn't related to her work. She sat on her bed and stared at Dongjun's business card for a long time. Her phone buzzed with a text from her coworker asking if she was okay, saying the manager had been freaking out after she disappeared with the VIP guest. Elizabeth typed a quick response saying everything was fine and she would explain tomorrow. But everything was not fine. She opened her contacts and scrolled until she found a name she hadn't looked at in years. It was saved under Do Not Answer, and the phone number attached to it was probably disconnected by now. Naomi. They were identical twins, born 7 minutes apart in a hospital in Oakland. For the first 18 years of their lives, they had been inseparable. They finished each other's sentences. They wore matching outfits until they were 12. They shared secrets that no one else would ever know. And then everything fell apart. Their parents died when they were 10, a car accident on a rainy highway. After that, their grandmother raised them in a small house in East Oakland, stretching her pension to make sure they had everything they needed. Elizabeth thrived. She threw herself into school, earned scholarships, and made their grandmother proud. She graduated from UC Berkeley with honors and got a job at a prestigious architecture firm before she was 23. Naomi went a different direction. She dropped out of community college. She started hanging around with people their grandmother didn't approve of. She borrowed money she never paid back. She lied constantly about where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. The final break came 4 years ago, when Elizabeth discovered that Naomi had stolen $8,000 from their grandmother's savings account. It was money their grandmother had set aside for her own medical expenses, for emergencies, for the final years of her life. Naomi had blown it all in 6 weeks on drugs, gambling, and a boyfriend, who disappeared the moment the money ran out. Elizabeth confronted her. Naomi denied everything. They screamed at each other in their grandmother's living room until a vase fell and shattered on the floor. Naomi left that night and never came back. Their grandmother died 2 years later, alone in a hospital bed. Elizabeth had been by her side. Naomi didn't even show up for the funeral. And now, 4 years after that terrible night, Elizabeth was holding a business card from a man who wanted her to find her sister and deliver her like a package. She set the card on her nightstand and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. What had Naomi got herself into? How had she ended up stealing from someone like Dongjun? And what was in that ledger that made it worth dying for? Because Elizabeth had seen the photograph. She had seen the look in Naomi's eyes. Her sister wasn't just running, she was terrified. At 3 a.m., after hours of lying awake, Elizabeth made a decision. She picked up her phone and texted the number on the business card. "I'll help, but I have conditions. Meet me tomorrow morning." The response came within 30 seconds. "A car will pick you up at 8 a.m. Be ready." Elizabeth put the phone down and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. The black sedan arrived at exactly 8 a.m. Elizabeth was waiting outside her apartment building, dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater, her braids pulled back in a low ponytail. One of Dong Jun's guards held the door open for her. She recognized him from the night before. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The car drove across the Bay Bridge and into the heart of Silicon Valley. Elizabeth watched the landscape change from the urban sprawl of Oakland to the sleek, modern towers of Palo Alto. They passed tech campuses that looked like universities and shopping centers that looked like museums. Finally, the car stopped in front of a glass high-rise that seemed to touch the clouds. Elizabeth was escorted through a private entrance, up a private elevator, and into a private office on the top floor. Dong Jun was waiting for her. He stood behind a black desk made of polished wood and steel, dressed in a navy suit with a white shirt and no tie. The casual look should have made him seem more approachable, but somehow it only emphasized how powerful he was, like he didn't need to dress up to prove anything. "You came," he said. "You gave me 24 hours. It's been 12. Dong Jun smiled slightly. "I had a feeling you wouldn't wait that long." He gestured toward a chair in front of his desk. Elizabeth sat down, keeping her posture straight and her expression neutral. "I've thought about your offer," she said, "and I have additional conditions." Dong Jun leaned back against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. "I'm listening." Elizabeth took a breath. "First, I won't be involved in anything illegal. I'm not going to help you hurt people, move money, or break any laws. If that's part of the deal, I'm walking out right now." Dong Jun nodded. "That's fair, continue." "Second, when we find Naomi, your people stay back. I talk to her first. Alone. If she agrees to return the ledger, we do it peacefully. No force, no intimidation." "Agreed." "Third, once the ledger is recovered, I walk away. Completely. No surveillance. No random visits. No phone calls at midnight. Our arrangement ends and we never see each other again." Dong Jun was quiet for a moment. His eyes studied her face with that same intensity she had felt the night before, like he was trying to read her thoughts. "Those are reasonable conditions," he finally said, "but I have one of my own." Elizabeth tensed. "What?" Dong Jun pushed off from the desk and walked slowly around it until he was standing in front of her. "Until the ledger is recovered, you work directly with me. Not my guards, not my assistants. Me, I need to understand how your sister thinks, how she moves, how she hides. And the only way to do that is to spend time with you." Elizabeth frowned. "That sounds like a full-time job." "It is," Dong Jun said. "Quit your other jobs today." Elizabeth almost laughed. "You're not serious." "I'm completely serious. I'll pay you triple your combined income from all 3 jobs, weekly, starting immediately." He walked back to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a black credit card. He slid it across the surface toward her. Elizabeth looked at the card. Her name was already printed on it in silver letters. This man had been so confident she would say yes that he'd already had it made. She should have been offended. She should have stood up and walked out. Instead, she found herself reaching for the card. "I'm not agreeing to anything permanent," she said firmly. "Once Naomi is found and the ledger is returned, this arrangement ends." "Of course," Dong Jun said. "That was your condition." Elizabeth slipped the card into her pocket and stood up. "So what happens now?" Dong Jun walked toward the door, gesturing for her to follow. "Now I show you my world, and we figure out how to find your sister." Over the next week, Elizabeth was pulled into a life she had never imagined. Dong Jun didn't run a single business. He ran dozens. Real estate developments in San Francisco, technology investments in Palo Alto, import-export operations that span the Pacific, a private security firm that contracted with corporations and governments alike. On the surface, everything was legal. The companies were registered. The taxes were paid. The employees had benefits and retirement plans. But Elizabeth wasn't naive. She knew that beneath the polished exterior, there were darker layers. She saw how people looked at Dong-jun when he entered a room. She noticed how quickly problems disappeared when he made a phone call. She understood that his power came from places that didn't appear on any balance sheet. She attended meetings where she was introduced as a consultant without any further explanation. She sat in conference rooms and listened to discussions about property acquisitions, contract negotiations, and strategic partnerships. She was given a security detail, 2 men who followed her everywhere and said almost nothing. She hated the lack of privacy. She hated the constant surveillance. She hated feeling like a prisoner in a gilded cage. But she also started to notice things about Dong-jun that surprised her. He donated millions anonymously to community programs in underserved neighborhoods. She found this out by accident when she overheard a phone call he didn't know she could hear. He was arranging for a youth center in East Palo Alto to receive a new computer lab and tutoring program. He paid his employees double the industry standard. His housekeeping staff had health care. His security guards had college funds for their children. His assistants received bonuses that allowed them to buy homes and start families. He treated the people who worked for him with respect, not fear, respect. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Elizabeth found herself alone with Dong-jun in his car, being driven back to his estate in Atherton, where she had been staying for security purposes. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Dong-jun looked at her. "Of course." "Why do you do it? The donations, the community programs, the employee benefits. You don't have to do any of that." Dong-jun was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights of Silicon Valley pass by outside the window. "My father came to America with $20 in his pocket," he said finally. "He worked 18-hour days for years. He built everything we have from nothing, but he never forgot where he came from. He always said that power means nothing if you don't use it to protect the people who depend on you." Elizabeth studied his profile. In the dim light of the car, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "Is that why you need the ledger back so badly?" she asked. "To protect your people?" Dong-jun turned to face her. His eyes were serious. "If that ledger gets into the wrong hands, it won't just destroy my organization. It will destroy the lives of hundreds of people who have done nothing wrong. Families will lose their incomes. Children will lose their futures. Some of my people have enemies who would kill them if their identities were exposed." Elizabeth felt the weight of his words settle over her. "I'm not asking you to understand my world," Dong-jun continued. "I'm not even asking you to approve of it, but I need you to believe that I'm not the villain in this story." Elizabeth wanted to argue. She wanted to remind him that his family had built their empire on things that most people would consider criminal. She wanted to maintain the distance she had carefully constructed between them. But looking at him now, she found it harder than she expected. "I believe you," she said quietly. Dong-jun held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the window, and they drove the rest of the way in silence. Elizabeth had been working on finding Naomi for 10 days without success. Dong-jun's people had already tried all the obvious methods. They had traced her phone, which had been destroyed within hours of the theft. They had searched her last known address, an apartment in Los Angeles that had been cleaned out completely. They had tracked her bank accounts, which had been emptied and closed. Naomi had disappeared like smoke. But Elizabeth knew her sister in ways that no investigator could. She knew the little habits, the secret codes, the childhood memories that shaped who Naomi became. One night, Elizabeth remembered something. When they were teenagers, she and Naomi had shared a private social media account under a fake name. It was a place where they posted inside jokes and coded messages that no one else could understand. Elizabeth logged into the account for the first time in years. It was still active. She posted a single message. "I found Grandma's peach cobbler recipe. Want to make it together?" It was a code they had used as children. A signal that meant, "I need to talk to you. It's important." Then she waited. 3 days later, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Elizabeth answered with her heart pounding. Hello. There was a pause, then a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years. Lizzie. Elizabeth's throat tightened. Naomi. Her sister's voice was tired, rough, nothing like the bright energy Elizabeth remembered from their childhood. Why are you reaching out now, after all this time? Elizabeth gripped the phone tighter. I know you're in trouble, I know what you stole, and I know there's a very powerful man looking for you. Silence on the other end. Then Naomi laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter, hollow. He found you, Naomi said. Of course he did. I should have known he would use you to get to me. He didn't use me, Elizabeth said. I agreed to help him. You what? Naomi's voice sharpened. Lizzie, you don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't some business dispute. These people are dangerous. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Elizabeth replied. And I need you to tell me what's really going on. Why did you steal from him, Naomi? What's in that ledger? Another long silence. When Naomi spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't steal anything, Lizzie. I took what was already ours. Elizabeth's heart stopped. What are you talking about? Naomi took a shaky breath. That ledger doesn't just contain Dongjun's secrets. It contains proof of what his family did to ours, to Mom and Dad. Elizabeth felt the room spin around her. Mom and Dad died in a car accident. What does that have to do with anything? It wasn't an accident, Naomi said. They were killed, murdered, and the man who ordered it was Dongjun's grandfather. Elizabeth couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The ledger has everything, Naomi continued, her voice cracking. Names, dates, a written confession. Dad worked for their organization, Lizzie. He was an accountant. He helped them move money for years. But when he tried to get out, when he tried to protect us, they killed him. And Mom was just collateral damage. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face. That's not possible. You're lying. I wish I was, Naomi said. I spent 3 years digging into this. I found the ledger by accident when I was looking for something else. And once I saw what was inside, I knew I couldn't let them bury it. Elizabeth's mind was racing. Her father. Her quiet, gentle father who read her bedtime stories and taught her to draw. He had worked for criminals. He had been murdered by them. And Dongjun, the man she had started to trust. The man who had shown her glimpses of humanity beneath his cold exterior. His family had destroyed hers. I have to go, Naomi said suddenly. I've already stayed on this line too long. They might be tracing it. Wait, Elizabeth said desperately. Naomi, please, we need to meet. We need to talk about this. Not yet, Naomi replied. I'm not done yet. There's something else in the ledger, something that could give us justice, give us closure. What is it? But Naomi had already hung up. Elizabeth sat in the dark, holding her phone against her chest, trying to process everything she had just learned. Her father was a criminal. Her parents were murdered. And the man she was working for was the grandson of their killer. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. She paced her room at Dongjun's estate, replaying every word of Naomi's call in her mind, trying to find holes in the story, reasons not to believe it. But deep down, she knew her sister was telling the truth. The next morning, she found Dongjun in his study, reviewing documents at his desk. He looked up when she entered and immediately noticed something was wrong. What happened? He asked. Elizabeth closed the door behind her. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. I talked to Naomi last night. Dongjun set his papers down and gave her his full attention. Where is she? I don't know, she wouldn't tell me, but she told me something else. Elizabeth walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens. She couldn't look at him while she said this. She told me that my father worked for your family, that he was an accountant who helped launder money for your organization. She heard Dongjun's chair move. His footsteps approached her. And she told me that when he tried to leave, your grandfather had him killed. Him and my mother both. Silence. Elizabeth turned around. Dongjun's face was unreadable, but something in his eyes had changed. something like shock. "She's lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is she?" Elizabeth stepped toward him. "Because she has proof. A written confession from your grandfather. It's in the ledger, Dongjun. That's why she took it." Dongjun's jaw tightened. He turned away from her and walked to his desk, gripping the edge with both hands. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Didn't know what? That your family murdered innocent people. That your empire is built on blood." He spun around, his eyes flashing. "I didn't know about your parents. I was a child when my grandfather ran this organization. By the time I took over, he was already dead. I've spent the last 10 years trying to clean up the messes he left behind." Elizabeth shook her head. "That doesn't change what happened. That doesn't bring my parents back." They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with anger and pain, and something neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Dongjun spoke. "If what your sister says is true, then I need to see the evidence. I need to know what my grandfather did, not to protect myself, to make it right." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. What she found instead was anguish, real, raw anguish. "You really didn't know," she said slowly. "No," Dongjun replied. "I didn't." Elizabeth felt some of her anger drain away, replaced by something more complicated. She had spent the whole night convincing herself that Dongjun was her enemy, but looking at him now, she saw someone who was just as trapped by his family's legacy as she was. "I need to find Naomi," Elizabeth said. "She has the proof, and she has answers I need." Dongjun nodded. "Then we find her together." 2 weeks later, Elizabeth received another message from Naomi. This time it was a location, a warehouse in East Los Angeles, a time, 3 days from now. Elizabeth told Dongjun everything. They agreed that his people would stay back, hidden, ready to intervene only if something went wrong. Elizabeth would go in alone and talk to her sister. But when Elizabeth arrived at the warehouse, something felt wrong. The building was old and covered in graffiti, sitting in an industrial neighborhood that had seen better days. The doors were unlocked. The lights inside flickered. Elizabeth walked through the entrance, her heart pounding. "Naomi," she called out, "I'm here, it's me." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Naomi stepped out of the shadows. She looked terrible, thinner than Elizabeth remembered, dark circles under her eyes. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was a mess, and she clutched the worn leather ledger against her chest like it was a lifeline. "Lizzie," Naomi breathed, "you actually came." Elizabeth walked toward her sister. "Of course I came. I've been trying to find you for weeks." They embraced, holding each other tightly. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face. Despite everything that had happened between them, this was still her sister, her twin, the other half of herself. "I'm so sorry," Naomi whispered. "For everything. For stealing from Grandma, for disappearing, for leaving you alone." Elizabeth pulled back and looked at her sister's face. "We can talk about all of that later. Right now, I need to understand what's happening. What's in that ledger that's worth dying for?" Naomi handed her the book. Elizabeth opened it carefully and began to read. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, dates, names, transaction records. It was a detailed history of the Kang family's operations going back decades. And near the back, she found what Naomi had described. A confession. Written in an old man's shaky handwriting, it described the murder of James and Patricia Moore, Elizabeth's parents. It explained that James had been an accountant for the organization for 15 years, but when he tried to leave with evidence that could expose the family, the decision was made to eliminate him. His wife was unfortunate collateral, the confession read, but necessary. Elizabeth felt sick. "There's more," Naomi said. "Dad didn't just try to leave, he tried to protect us. He had been secretly moving money into an offshore account for years. Money he was going to use to disappear with us, to start a new life somewhere safe." Elizabeth looked up. "How much money?" $15 million. It's still there. Dad left instructions for accessing it, but they were hidden in our grandmother's house. I found them after she died. Elizabeth's mind was spinning. $15 million. Enough to change their lives completely. Enough to give them the fresh start their father had wanted for them. Why didn't you tell me? Elizabeth demanded. When you found out about all this, why did you run away instead of coming to me? Naomi's eyes filled with tears. Because I was trying to protect you. The moment I started digging, I knew I was putting myself in danger. I didn't want you anywhere near this. I thought if I could just get the ledger, expose the truth, and disappear, you would be safe. Elizabeth grabbed her sister's hands. We're in this together now. Whatever happens, we face it together. Before Naomi could respond, the warehouse doors burst open. Dongjun's men poured in, weapons drawn, surrounding them within seconds. And Dongjun walked in behind them, his face a mask of cold fury. Elizabeth's heart dropped. You followed me. I had no choice, Dongjun said, his voice flat. You weren't answering your phone. I thought something had happened to you. He turned his gaze to Naomi, who clutched the ledger tighter. Give me the book, he said. Naomi shook her head. Not until the world sees what's inside. Dongjun stepped closer. If that ledger goes public, hundreds of people will suffer. People who had nothing to do with my grandfather's crimes. People who depend on me for their livelihoods. And what about my parents? Naomi shot back. Who suffers for them? Elizabeth stepped between them. Enough, both of you. She turned to Dongjun. You said you wanted to make things right. Here's your chance. Let me take the ledger. Let me decide what happens to it. Dongjun's eyes bore into hers. You're asking me to trust you with the power to destroy everything I've built. Yes, Elizabeth said. I am. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating. Dongjun's men stood ready, waiting for orders. Naomi stood behind Elizabeth, trembling. Finally, Dongjun raised his hand. His men lowered their weapons. Take it, he said quietly. But whatever you decide, I need to know first, before it goes anywhere else. Elizabeth nodded. She took the ledger from Naomi's hands and held it against her chest. For better or worse, the truth was now in her hands. Elizabeth spent 3 days reading every page of the ledger. She cross-referenced names with public records. She verified dates with newspaper archives. She traced the money trails and confirmed the existence of the offshore account. Everything Naomi said was true. Their father had worked for the Kang organization. He had tried to leave, and he had been murdered for it, along with their mother. But the ledger contained something else, something Naomi hadn't mentioned. Elizabeth's father hadn't just been an accountant. He had been gathering evidence against the organization for years. He had been working with a federal prosecutor, secretly building a case that would have brought down the entire empire. He hadn't been running away. He had been trying to do the right thing. And he had died for it. Elizabeth brought this information to Dongjun at his estate. She laid the ledger on his desk and told him everything. Dongjun read the pages in silence. When he finished, he looked like a man who had just watched his world collapse. My grandfather wasn't just a criminal, he said quietly. He was a murderer. Yes, Elizabeth replied. Dongjun stood and walked to the window. There are men still in my organization who were loyal to my grandfather. Men who knew about this and kept it hidden from me. They let me believe I was leading something honorable when the foundation was built on blood. Elizabeth watched him carefully. What are you going to do? Dongjun turned to face her. His eyes were hard with resolve. I'm going to clean house, he said. Every person who knew about your parents' murder and said nothing. Every loyalist who protected my grandfather's legacy. They're done. Over the next 48 hours, Elizabeth watched Dongjun dismantle the old guard of his organization. He called meetings, made accusations, and presented evidence. Men who had been with the family for decades were stripped of their positions, their assets frozen, their access revoked. It was brutal. It was necessary. When it was over, Dongjun came to Elizabeth with a proposal. The offshore account your father created, he said. The $15 million, it's rightfully yours and Naomi's. I won't touch it. Elizabeth shook her head. That money came from your organization. It's dirty. Then clean it, Dongjun replied. Use it to build something good. Honor your father's memory by doing what he couldn't. Elizabeth thought about her dream of opening an architecture consultancy. She thought about the community programs Dongjun funded. She thought about all the ways $15 million could be used to help people instead of hurt them. "I'll think about it," she said. Dongjun stepped closer to her. "There's something else I need to say." Elizabeth looked up at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what my family did to yours, I can never undo it. But I promise you, as long as I'm alive, nothing like this will ever happen again." Elizabeth saw the sincerity in his eyes, the pain, the determination. And for the first time since learning the truth, she felt something other than anger. She felt hope. 6 months later, Elizabeth stood in the center of her brand new architecture and design consultancy in Seattle. The space was everything she had ever dreamed of: bright, modern, and filled with the energy of a team she had personally assembled. Sketches and blueprints covered every surface. Scale models of upcoming projects lined the shelves. Her first major commission was a community center in South Seattle, funded by an anonymous donor she knew all too well. The project would include after-school programs, job training facilities, and a youth recreation center. It was exactly the kind of work she had always wanted to do. Naomi had left the country 3 months ago after reconciling with Elizabeth. She was living in Portugal now, renting a small apartment near the beach. She sent video messages every week, showing off her new life, talking about the future for the first time in years. They had used part of their father's money to set up a foundation in their parents' names. The James and Patricia Moore Foundation would fund educational programs in underserved communities across the country. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was something. A way to honor the memory of 2 people who had been taken too soon. The door to Elizabeth's studio opened, and Dongjun walked in. He looked different these days, more relaxed, less guarded. He wore jeans and a simple sweater instead of his usual suits. No guards followed him inside. He looked around the studio and smiled. "You did it." Elizabeth walked toward him. "We did it." Their relationship had developed slowly over the past 6 months. There had been difficult conversations, therapy sessions, and moments when Elizabeth wasn't sure they could overcome everything that stood between them. His family had destroyed hers. That wasn't something you could just forget. But Dongjun wasn't his grandfather. He wasn't his family's legacy. He was the man who had torn apart his own organization to make things right. The man who had handed her the power to destroy him and trusted her not to use it. The man who showed up at her studio in Seattle without bodyguards or pretense, just to see her smile. "I have something for you," Dongjun said. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Elizabeth's heart stuttered. "What is that?" "Open it." She took the box with trembling hands and lifted the lid. Inside was a key. "It's for the building next door." Dongjun explained. "I bought it last month. I thought you might want to expand your studio eventually. More space for your team, room for bigger projects." Elizabeth stared at the key, then at him. "You bought me a building." "I invested in your vision," he corrected. "There's a difference." She laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're unbelievable." "I prefer supportive." Elizabeth set the box down and stepped closer to him. She placed her hands on his chest and looked into his eyes. "I spent a long time being angry at the world," she said. "Angry at my sister, angry at myself, angry at the circumstances that took everything from me." Dongjun placed his hands over hers. "And now? Now I'm ready to stop being angry. I'm ready to build something instead." He leaned down and kissed her softly. When he pulled back, there was a warmth in his eyes that she had never seen before. "Then let's build it together," he said. 1 year later, Elizabeth stood on a stage at the grand opening of the James and Patricia Moore Community Center. Hundreds of people filled the audience. Local politicians, community leaders, families from the neighborhood. Dongjun stood in the front row, watching her with pride. Naomi appeared on a large screen behind her, beaming from her apartment in Lisbon, attending virtually because she still wasn't quite ready to come home. Elizabeth stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," she said. "This building represents more than just bricks and concrete. It represents a promise that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story, a promise that the past doesn't have to define the future, a promise that we can take the worst things that happen to us and transform them into something beautiful." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "My parents were taken from me when I was 10 years old. For a long time, I thought I would never recover from that loss. But standing here today, surrounded by all of you, I realize something important." She smiled through her tears. "They would be proud, and that's all I ever wanted." The crowd erupted in applause. Elizabeth looked at Dongjun. He was clapping too, his eyes bright. She looked at Naomi on the screen. Her sister was crying and laughing at the same time. And she looked at the building behind her, the building she had designed, the building that carried her parents' names. She had done it. Not despite everything she had been through, but because of it. Later that night, Elizabeth and Dongjun walked through the empty community center, admiring the finished space. "Are you happy?" Dongjun asked. Elizabeth took his hand. "I think I finally am." They stopped in front of a large window that looked out over the Seattle skyline. The city glittered in the darkness, full of possibility. "What's next?" Dongjun asked. Elizabeth smiled. "Whatever we want." And for the first time in her life, she believed it. If you made it to the end of this story, you're amazing. Drop a comment and let me know what part hit you the hardest. Was it when Elizabeth learned the truth about her parents? When Naomi finally reached out? When Dongjun tore apart his own organization to make things right? I want to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button and join the family. New stories drop every day. I'll see you in the next one.